I'm concerned about EMP bombs and electromagnetic pulse bombs. And China's incursion into space is very worrisome to me. Can you give us an update on their status at the moment?
Yeah. An EMP, electromagnetic pulse device, will, when detonated over the atmosphere, take out our grids. So if you're thinking of using electricity this afternoon, it might be a little problem if the Chinese detonate one. And this with the spy balloon, you know, the package under that balloon was a surveillance one, but they could have easily put a nuclear weapon, detonated over the atmosphere. Basically, that's an EMP device, and the death tolls that are estimated from taking out our grid
90%.
are 90% over 6 months. I mean, it's just astounding numbers. And you think, how can that be? But then if you think about everything that you use electricity for, unless you're a farmer, you know, you basically don't have access to food after a while. And you certainly won't have water. You're not going to drive your car, because your car, which my car is old, but it still has computer chips in it. And so you basically, it won't run. So, I mean, the point here is that the Chinese have obviously developed these. They've given them essentially to the North Koreans, because the North Koreans are believed to have EMP devices. Now, we can do the same thing, but the point is whoever strikes first has an enormous advantage, and the Chinese are the ones who are going to be moving first. So, yeah, it is something that we don't talk about too much. In general, the Chinese have been going after our grids. Like the big Northeast blackout at the beginning of this century could very well have been caused by a Chinese hacker making a few mistakes and taking down the grid in Ohio, and it just sort of spread throughout the U.S., Northeast U.S. We don't know that for sure, but there are indications that that's occurred. Also, there was a blackout in Florida that's probably China related. So the Chinese have been working very hard on this. And remember, there have been a number of sabotage events against substations in the last year or so. We got to assume that in the first months, the first hours of a war, we are going to have, going back to Chris's point about Chinese in our country, they're going to be, some of those people are going to be destroying our infrastructure. I mean, they don't even need an EMP device for that. Remember, right now, the number of Chinese refugees coming across our southern border has increased by 800% over the last year. And this is absolutely fascinating in terms of what's going on. Most of those people are refugees. They just want to be in our country. But I am sure that the Ministry of State Security is seeding its agents into that refugee flow. And that means there are a lot of people coming into our country that that are here to be sleeper agents. So it's all tied together in terms of a concerted campaign against our infrastructure. The one thing we learned from the spy balloon incident, and this sort of goes to just the broader issue of all this, is that even our military is not thinking about how to protect ourselves. They saw, as they said, this balloon lift off from Hainan Island on, I think, January 21 or something. Right. And yet they didn't have the wherewithal to shoot it down as soon as it entered American airspace in the Aleutians, where they could have taken it down over uninhabited territory.
They probably had a woke class to attend.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard that, but Linda said that maybe they were attending woke classes. Thank you, Linda, because you're probably right about that. The point is, our military is not, they're very capable, but they are not thinking. Thank you, dear.
That's why you brought me.
So we have a military that is not thinking of the nature of the dangers, whether we're talking EMP or sabotage against our infrastructure. So it's all part of a much larger package. But the Chinese, even if they didn't detonate an EMP device, see, the one reason why they wouldn't do it is because we would know where an EMP device came from, because it's on the end of a missile. We know where the missile takes off, so we would retaliate. But we don't know about someone who blows up a substation in Old Saybrook.
Well,
So-
we don't retaliate for the balloon. Why would we know to retaliate that?
Well, the Gordon-Chang formula for retaliating for the balloon would be to close the 4 Chinese consulates, which would be a disproportionate response. Because they're using it for spying. You know, American foreign policy analysts, sorry for going on here, but you just got me going. American foreign policy analysts believe in proportionate responses. In other words, they believe that restraint is responsible. And you can sort of understand the argument for that. But the counter argument is that if our response is proportionate, it means China on balance suffers no cost. So for the spy balloon incident, the answer to it, we're not going to be flying balloons over China, going back to your point. But what we can do is we can close the 4 consuls here, and they would say, well, that's disproportionate. And I would say, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to make you hurt. And we want to make you hurt so much that you will never think of doing this again.
Hi, Sally from Panama. I have 2 questions. I have 2 questions, unrelated. One, what about these, suddenly we're getting a huge influx of Chinese coming across the southern border. Who are these people? They don't look poor when you see them. And the other question is totally different. It's what is the relationship and how does China think about using North Korea?
Yeah, the first question is easier. Those guys are not poor. Your average migrant pays a cartel, and I forget the amount, it's something like the order of $5,000, $10,000 to be smuggled across their southern border. Chinese pay $35,000. The other thing is that migrants from particular countries go through our border at specific locations, you know, one country, one location. The Chinese have been coming across all locations from California to Texas, which means that this is much better organized. I've got a friend named Michael Yon, who's a reporter, journalist, former special operator, and he reports that in the Darien Gap is that very dangerous area between Panama and Colombia, which is hard to get across. But all of these refugees are coming across the Darien Gap. And the Chinese have been able to do it much quicker than others have been able to. Basically, he says that the Chinese get from China to the Darien Gap in 3 weeks, which means that there's a well-organized effort to get them into our country, which means that the Chinese triads are working on it and cartels in Latin America are. So obviously it's a very different operation for Chinese than it is for people from Costa Rica, for instance. Or Venezuela or wherever. On your second question, there's a great debate among foreign policy analysts about how much the North Korea and China cooperate. And a lot of people, very smart people, will tell you, well, the Koreans hate the Chinese, so obviously Beijing has no pull over the North Koreans, which is what China tells our diplomats all the time. They told it to Trump, they told it to Obama, I'm sure they've told it to Biden. That is wrong. And the reason is that, yes, the Koreans hate the Chinese. I mean, viscerally hate the Chinese. But the Kim regime in Pyongyang knows that it cannot survive without China's help. So when China wants something, North Korea will always answer yes. Now, the Chinese don't always ask. And the Chinese allow the North Koreans to be disobedient to sort of create this image that the Chinese don't control the North Koreans. But when China wants something, they get it. And the most visible demonstration of this was when Kim Jong-un, the current ruler in North Korea, he traveled to Chinese soil 4 times before Xi Jinping gave a return visit to Pyongyang. And that's an indication that Kim Jong-un knew that he had no choice but to obey the Chinese, because that's humiliating in the world of diplomacy to do that. When we see the nature of relationship, the Chinese control the North Koreans. They do it with money, they do it with food, and they do it with nuclear weapons and missile technology that the Chinese supply to the North Koreans. The reason why the Chinese do this You might say, well, if these guys hate us, why do we make them stronger? And the reason is that every time the North Koreans act up, we send our Secretary of State to Beijing to plead for Chinese cooperation, and China gets concessions from us for saying they will cooperate, but not actually doing so. So it's a grand game for China, and we continually fall for it because we're oblivious and we're Americans and we think we're entitled to be stupid. I don't know. So, I mean, this is controversial. I mean, different people will give you different answers on it, and it's something that Korea experts debate for years. But I think that the debate we have seen recently, people are starting to understand how much control China has over the Korean regime. That's a great question, by the way, so thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is Carolyn Field. I'm from Essex.
Two people from Essex.
One of my daughters lived in China for 7 years. She returned in 2014, and two of her comments I thought were interesting. One was that she and a number of the expats that she knew felt that the Chinese government was afraid of its own people. They regarded them as this unruly mass that could erupt at any moment. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how much of a counterbalance to Chinese expansionary ambitions would that be?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. China has the world's largest surveillance state. If they felt confident in the attitudes of the Chinese people, they wouldn't need to do that. If they really felt confident, they'd hold elections. They're not doing that either. We saw a graphic demonstration of how volatile Chinese society is at the end of October. If you got an iPhone, chances are it was made in Zhengzhou in central China by a company called Foxconn, which is a subcontractor. And there at the iPhone factory, it's called iPhone City, by the way, and because more than half the world's iPhones are made there. At the end of October, workers there just rebelled. They climbed over fences, they were running through the fields because they had had it with COVID. And this was a visible demonstration of disobedience. And what was even more interesting was you had the villagers who lived around that plant and truckers were helping, at great risk to themselves, helping workers flee. But it was really demonstrated on November 24th. On November 24th, there was a fire in Urumqi, which is in northwestern China. And there were videos that the Chinese people saw where the fire trucks couldn't get close enough to the building because there were COVID barriers in the streets. And so the plumes of water were not reaching the building. Plus also people soon realized that many of the victims died because they were sealed shut into their apartments from the outside because of quarantine. So immediately, no organization, no coordination, no leadership, there were protests across China. And these protests were not just over COVID rules, but also people were saying, down with the Communist Party, down with Xi Jinping. So you can be sure that China's a volatile society. Now, Beijing, because it does have this big surveillance state, was able to restore order, but the communist rulers could see what happened. And since that time, there have been sporadic protests. Now there's a protest in Wuhan. Older people not getting benefits are now protesting. It's just, so China's a volatile society. And, your daughter's observation was 100% right. And we know throughout Chinese history, not just the history of the People's Republic, but Chinese history, that every once in a while the Chinese people erupt and they get rid of their rulers, usually with a lot of violence. And so that's going to happen again.
Go and comment on how the elite is also disloyal to the party because of COVID.
Yeah, COVID's a very interesting story because a lot of senior cadres, senior officials died from the disease. And this was especially true this most recent round, starting, let's say, September, October of last year. And so you hear a lot of dissenting voices from people who are beneficiaries of the regime, because Xi Jinping had what's known as a zero COVID policy, which was like one of the strictest policies on earth, which meant the regime tried to prevent any transmission of the disease at all. So there was daily testing of everybody. Sometimes people got tested 2 or 3 times. People got locked in their apartments, all sorts of things. And people were just sick and fed up with that. On December 7th, the National Health Commission issued a 10-point plan which essentially ended zero COVID, and then the disease ripped through Chinese society. I mentioned 1 billion or so infections this winter. And then the Chinese people said, okay, well, what was 3 years of lockdowns for if you were going to let the disease rip? And so the regime right now has a real problem dealing with this. And, you know, the responsible thing would have been to do what some of these Scandinavian countries would do, is just sort of get herd immunity and do the rest of it, because this disease was going to defeat any disease control measures. I mean, no matter what you tried to do, you could vaccinate people, wouldn't work. You could force them to wear masks, it didn't work. You could lock them in their homes, it didn't work. This disease was highly transmissible, and it was going to defeat government measures. So people then realized, well, okay, then why didn't they do this 3 years ago? Why did I go through 3 years of misery and pain? So they got a problem now. They got a lot of people who don't think the Communist Party is competent anymore.
So we're going to take one more question right here, and then I know you want a couple of minutes to say something, and he'll be around a few minutes to do a few more individual conversations.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you so much for this presentation. I've long thought that China was a global threat in a way that Russia does not have the power to be. And I wonder, I guess in two-part question, are we distracted from a greater threat in China by the attention that's been put on Russia over the last year? And is our behavior towards Russia and the animus in Europe towards them pushing them into the arms of China, or is that a natural alliance that was going to take place anyways?
Oh, that's a great question. And how many hours do I have to answer that?
As long as you know.
Kennedy's not on for a while yet.
Yeah, right. I don't even know where to begin on that one. But let me say that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping see the world in the same terms, because they see that their interests coincide, and they identify the same adversary, and that's us. So I don't think that we could push Putin into Xi Jinping's arms or vice versa. And so I think that essentially what's happened is deterrence has broken down. With the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the bad guys are now doing what they would have done, but were afraid to do. You know, one can say whatever you want about Trump foreign policy, but Trump scared the crap out of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. You know, because you were there. They never were sure whether he was going to do what he said he was going to do, but they could never be sure he wouldn't do it. So they didn't take him on, which shows, well, Vladimir Putin attacked Crimea in 2014 during Obama, and he attacked the rest of Ukraine during Biden. 4 years, despite the narrative, that the Russians had bought Trump, the dossier, the Steele dossier on the, who knows what's true, but they were afraid of him, and we had 4 years of peace. Now, the problem here is going to be the Chinese are watching very closely what we do with Ukraine, because I think the best way to deter Xi Jinping over Taiwan or whatever is to make sure that Vladimir Putin loses. Now, I know that's a controversial statement, but the point is these bad leaders, they're working very closely with each other, and they take their cues from each other. We can see during our lifetimes, there have been times when peace has broken out across the world because good trends tend to reinforce each other. But the opposite is also true. Bad trends reinforce each other. And right now, it is the destructive forces that are driving events. So, whatever the relationship is between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, they are now feeding off of each other. And we see this. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping has met Biden one time in person. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have met 39 times in person. And that gives you a sense of the closeness of the relationship that they have. And that means that we're in a world of hurt right now, because we're going to deal with not only Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, we got to deal with Kim Jong-un, going back to your point, we got to deal with who's ever in charge in Iran right now. We got to deal with Maduro in Venezuela. And it's just, they're all thinking this is a moment of opportunity. So that's why this is such a critical time, which is going back to the point about, well, why is Taiwan so important? Well, deterrence is broken down. And we do not need World War III to fight right now. So we need to reestablish deterrence. And reestablishing deterrence is one of the most dangerous things you can do, because they don't believe us anymore. You know, Biden has, just to give you one example, Biden has told the Chinese, thou shalt not provide military assistance to Russia and Ukraine. He said that's the red line. But from the very beginning of this war, the Chinese have been supplying the Russian military with all sorts of stuff, and Biden never imposes costs on China. So the Chinese think, oh, why don't I just continue on? At some point, Biden's going to actually have to impose a cost. The Chinese aren't going to believe him, and there's going to be, you know, a spiral downward, because eventually we got to start protecting ourselves. That's really dangerous when you try to reestablish deterrence, when you need to impose those costs because the bad guys don't believe you. World War II in Europe. Remember, Britain and France told Hitler, you can't do this, you can't do that. We know from the German archives that, and remember, Britain and France said to Germany, if you invade Poland, there will be war. We know from the archives that Hitler did not believe London and Paris. And why should he? You know, the British and the French, they warned Hitler over remilitarization of the Rhineland, absorption of Austria, taking the parts of Czechoslovakia that they were not permitted under the Munich Pact, and Britain and France never did anything. So Hitler obviously thought he could invade Poland and Britain and France would stay on the sidelines. So who was the most, who gets the award for the most surprised person in September 1939? Well, it's Hitler. That's how we're going to get in war this time, because the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans aren't going to believe us when we actually have to do something. So let me just close for a few moments here. My wife told me that I've got to end on an optimistic note. And after 29 years of marriage, I have learned, I think, there's no point in arguing. So here's my optimistic story about a time when the world was in war. So my dad came to this country from China shortly before the end of the Second World War. He got a scholarship from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists to study in the US. And so he took a plane over the Himalayas, landed in India, boarded a Liberty ship, which went all the way down to Australia to avoid Japanese submarines, and then came north, and he landed in the port of San Pedro, which is Los Angeles, in February 1945. He took the Transcontinental Railroad, got himself to Ithaca, New York, got his master's in civil engineering in 1946 from Cornell. And then Mao Zedong's communists beat Chiang Kai-shek, and a generous America allowed my dad to stay. So what did my dad do? Well, he took his engineering degree and he opened up a 4-table restaurant in his garage in dilapidated Keansburg, New Jersey, and was serving Chinese food. And of course this failed. So he went to Plan B. And Plan B was to use his engineering degree for engineering. He got a job with Public Service Electric and Gas, which was the utility in northern New Jersey. But on the day he turned 55, the first day he was eligible for early retirement, he took it and he opened up not even a restaurant, a Chinese takeout place in Madison, New Jersey, which, you talk Kendra, you were Madison, Connecticut, where my best friend lives. So this is Madison, New Jersey. So he opens up this takeout place, becomes successful, then ends up with a restaurant. Takes some of the money from the restaurant, buys a building, and renovates it, and sparks the rejuvenation of the town center in Madison. Now, my dad never missed an opportunity to vote. And by the way, Chris, this is a story about a Chinese student. My dad never missed an opportunity to tell my 3 sisters and me how great his adopted country was. And he would always say, China was his birthplace, but America was his home. And so here's the optimistic story. I learned from my dad that not only is America a great country, but that we are a good people. And I want to thank you all for defending the country that my dad loved so much.
Thank you, Gordon. I don't think we can really express how much we really appreciate him coming in, but I think everybody is eternally grateful.